Hi, Matt here in the Hawkbinge edit studio. We usually find that we can rely on Zoom to record ourselves whenever we have guests on our podcast, but unfortunately this time we found the service was dropping words, creating sonic artifacts, and generally making things sound weird for some reason. We've cleaned it up as best we can, but I wanted to quickly apologise if anyone finds this episode harder work than usual. We appreciate you bearing with us, and without further ado, here's that intro theme.
Technicians of Spaceship Earth, welcome to Hawkbinge, your guide to the astral plane that is the 1990s, in the company of long-term fan, which is me, and of course your first-time listener through the 90s, which is Matt. Hello, Matt.
Hello, everyone.
But also, because this is the 90s wrap-up show, end of the decade, end of the season, we are joined by the very honoured guest, Mr. Ian Abrahams. Welcome back, Ian.
Hi, all. Thanks for having me back.
It seems like recent history to me that we chatted to you about Live Chronicles, but actually it's going back 2.5 years or something crazy.
Is it really? Wow.
Yeah, it's absolutely mad. We have been in 90s Hawkwind for 2 years, which is quite something. And we've been really looking forward to getting you back on to talk about all things Hawkwind in the 90s. Before we do that, we have a competition winner to announce.
Last episode, we put out the competition for a crazy edition of Paul Garbutt's first book, a normal version of his second book, and a Hawkbind t-shirt of the winner's size and design choice. The challenge was name a track by Hawkwind that references the band by name in the lyrics. The expectation was that people would spot that there was a track in the very album we were talking about that features the band. You actually even quoted it directly from Ian's review, Andy, which was Captain Riz chanting, "Hawkwind in your area, Hawkwind in your land." And Paul suspected that it was, in fact, the only track that featured the band in it. And some people definitely clocked it and emailed in with that answer. However, other people spotted other times that the band have name-checked themselves, including Crosstalk from Choose Your Masks, Don't Understand from Electric TP, EMC from Xenon Codex, and The Church from Church of Hawkwind. And it was David Collinge who heard the Hawkwind chants on Church of Hawkwind from the track The Church, who has been randomly selected by our random number generator to be the winner. So congratulations to David Collinge. We'll be reaching out to you via email as soon as this goes out.
Yes, David, pick out your design of choice from the ones available. We'll email you the details. And congratulations. We've heard a few other things, right?
Yeah, I think we're actually fast following for us, so we don't have so much correspondence. However, a few people got in touch, so I wanted to say hi to them. So hi to Jules Street, who emailed in to say, "I've recently discovered your podcast. It's great to hear your reviews of the albums one by one. I don't have much opportunity to play them from start to finish like I used to, but they're running through my head when you're talking about them. I've just finished your assessment of Silver Machine, so I'm sure I'll keep listening for a good few podcasts yet." It's funny when people have got whole seasons to go through and they won't hear this until quite some time later. But Jules, if you made it all the way to the end of the 90s, hello. And also on YouTube, someone who just goes as Darth Vader commented, "The reason most Hawkwind fans don't consider this being in your area, the album, as a legit release is because it came out in America first. This was no accident. Doug Smith had split with the band again, and Dave came to me with this album because, as far as I understand it, EBS was now defunct in the UK. Dave sent me the tapes and all of the artwork and lyrics of the booklet. I designed the cover, but in truth, the front cover was supposed to be the back and vice versa. If it had been that way around, you would have been able to read the track titles a lot easier. I was told that the preference was to reverse them, so that's what I did." That YouTube handle is very annoying because I'm assuming that the actual Darth Vader didn't take his time out of his busy schedule conquering a galaxy far, far away. He published Hawkwind CDs in the US, but, maybe Disney Plus will cover that in a streaming series in the future. But if Mr. Darth Vader hears this and wants to let us know who he is, it would be super interesting to hear a little bit more of that before we go into season 4. But if not, then may the force be with you either way.
Indeed, well said. I suspect how albums are distributed and on what platforms must be more to do with the labels than the band themselves. And Hawkwind have had a few of those, so it's probably not Hawkwind being dealt with as one single collection of all the albums. It's lots of different rights holders of lots of different records. Would that ring true with you, Ian?
I can't say this for sure, but I believe that Cherry Red may now have the next tranche of catalogue on from Distant Horizons. They haven't done anything with it if that's the case, but I suspect, again, that's probably because they're working through these enormous United Artists era box sets, so maybe we'll see something later in the year. And my guess is Darth Vader is Godwin, so that's my guess on that one.
I love the idea of Cherry Red having the rest of the catalogue because they do seem to be pretty good caretakers of the Hawkwind legacy. I love the box sets they've been putting out. There seems to be some proper care and reverence for these things. So if they're going to get a bit of treatment for some of the later albums, that would be pretty nice. And actually, it's interesting you mentioned Robert Godwin, Ian, because I was going to bring him up because we didn't know who he was when we recorded In Your Area. And I did a, admittedly, fairly cursory bit of research and didn't turn him up. But some of the correspondence received afterwards showed that he's actually quite the player in Hawkwind history.
Yeah, certainly in terms of keeping that legacy in America and keeping stuff coming out after Emergency Broadcast System became no more as a label. And, he's been a big champion of the band in America. So, an important figure, I would say.
Yeah. So, Rob, if you ever hear any of this, apologies for not knowing who you were when we recorded In Your Area. But we do know who you are now. And thanks so much on behalf of everybody for all of your efforts on behalf of Hawkwind and Hawkwind Music. And maybe one day we'd get the chance to chat to you. All of which brings us round to the 1990s for Hawkwind, which is an incredibly interesting decade, a real roller coaster, I think, for Matt and I. I wanted to start with something kind of at the beginning. Space Bandits has always felt to me like a follow-on from Xenon Codex, and it feels like the end of the 80s more than it feels like the beginning of the 90s. And it's that wall of sound synthesizer on Electric TP that feels to me like it brings the 90s in. But you've written that you see the foundations of the 90s in Space Bandits.
Yeah, I think so. I think if you look at the 90s generally, it starts off with that filmed concert at Lenton Lane Studios for the Bedrock TV series for Channel 4, if I remember correctly, where they're this lush, big-sounding six-piece band. Really fantastic recording. The videos are great. Within 15 months, they're a three-piece schlepping around America, which is just such an incredible change. And actually then they learned to make that work. But it's such a revolution because the 80s were pretty consistent, weren't they? If you track it right through from Levitation and then the RCA albums and then the Flick Knife stuff and on to Xenon Codex, there's not a huge upheaval in terms of memberships. Some people get reassigned different roles in Brock's prime ministerial reshuffle at Stonehenge. But it's a pretty consistent decade. And then you get to the 90s and there's all this different stuff going on. But that was the thing that struck me when I was thinking about it, was that big leap, not from Xenon Codex to Space Bandits, but actually from the Lenton Lane recording for Channel 4 to where they were 15 months later. It's really intriguing. But yeah, I think Space Bandits is a bit of a curate's egg in a way, isn't it? It's the first half and the second half, and the first half's great, and the second half sort of fizzles out a little bit. But yeah, I do see it more as a starting point for the 1990s, the way things get more extended. Images, you wouldn't have had a track of that intensity and length and speed on anything of the 80s. So it's not really a hangover from the 80s. It is the starting point for the 90s, but upheavals in the membership, of course, sent it in a different direction.
Indeed, Matt, you've grown used to your WTF moment whenever you hear Hawkwind albums that are new to you. That was an interesting entry into the 90s.
Yeah, it being a fairly Brockless first album of the 90s was a big surprise. Obviously, him coming in for Ship of Dreams, but Images being the first track, which really rubs the Brocklessness in your face for quite a long time, was very interesting. I did say this actually about Wings, which ended up being the playlist pick, that I thought that Hawkwind's most 80s track was in the 90s. the very beginning of the 90s, but Wings felt very 80s somehow, but in a good way. And I thought by the time they got to Electric TP, they had definitely removed most of the things that I don't like personally about the 80s. LSD is very raw, and that being the first track of Electric TP really let you know that they were going more into that direction. For me, I feel like the 90s started pretty high and slowly slid down. On balance, Space Bandits is probably my favorite album of the 90s. I think the most surprising is White Zone, which is a little blip that I know not everyone counts, but I'm really glad it was there as a little thing in the middle to break everything up, literally bang in the middle of the releases of the 7. I think probably It Is the Business was the one which we had the most trouble for, and is definitely one of the reasons why it took 2 years to eat our way through the 90s, because that album I just had to listen so much so before I just didn't feel like I was absolutely loathing it. Space Bandits has some of the most interesting things in it. I still love TV Suicide. I know we say that like it's one of two halves, but I think Black Elk Speaks, Out of the Shadows, TV Suicide, there's some really strong tracks on that. It ended up being quite experimental towards the end of the 90s, didn't it? With playing with things like Abducted on Alien 4 and, still keeping some of that Hawkwindness, that idea of that storytelling and these little sonic adventures rather than just tracks. So definitely I feel like the spirit of Hawkwind is alive. Even us filling out our top 10 albums from the Facebook top 40, the fact that there were albums and tracks from the 90s that made that list made you feel that even though maybe Hawkwind weren't as quote unquote popular, they still have people who like things. And I still have things from what they put out in the 90s that I really like. They were also a band that started to really fill up CDs. There were some really long albums in the 90s. Alien 4 going into 15 tracks was quite a lot to get through. It's been a chewy decade with some nice surprises.
I really like that period, 91, 92, 93, 94, when they're playing as a trio. And I saw them a few times in that era. I mean, I saw Bristol on the Space Bandits tour, which was the last full band lineup I saw before they shrunk down to the three-piece. With the exception of Bridget's last gig at a very cold, echoey leisure centre in Exeter. But Bristol Coliseum in 92 on the TP tour and Troy City Hall in 1993. Troy City Hall is now the Hall for Cornwall, which is where my day job exists and has done for the last 8 years. So we had Hawkwind there in 2023, which was a bizarre experience of having Hawkwind at the place I was working. My boss said to me a few years ago, I was talking to somebody who used to run the programming and the venue at Troy City Hall, and she mentioned about having Hawkwind playing there. And my boss, Julie, said, well, you tell me more, because Ian will be really interested in this. And she said, it was strange. We booked Hawkwind, and there was only 3 of them. And I was there during the day, and they were setting up and sound checking, and my mum came with me. And she said, I left her in the hall, and I came back. And all I could see was the band sound checking, and my mum standing in the middle of the hall with her blue rinse in her handbag, completely gobsmacked. And she said, I've never heard 3 people make so much noise. And it just reminded me the first time I went to interview Richard Chadwick for Sonic Assassins. And I said, 3-piece Hawkwind, though. I really like that era, Richard. On paper, it don't sound right, does it? And he said, well, what it meant was each man had to make more noise.
They did sound massive. I mean, I saw them live as a 3-piece in a club in Brighton, which I think was called Prism. Not a huge venue, generally a nightclub. I can't remember the year. I think it was probably in the Business of Future tour. And it just sounded huge. I do remember thinking that just the 3 of them on stage sounded enormous. Lots of instrumentals, and the whole thing blended together as one long piece. And occasionally you'd pick out that this was a track that you knew. But what was interesting about all of that to me was that thing that you said about through the 80s, them being very consistent. If they'd have remained very consistent through the 90s, they'd probably have disappeared, wouldn't they? Because, in fact, the ability to completely transform and somehow riding that wave with whatever the current thing is. And obviously the current thing then was a lot of trance, techno, and they were in it.
They really were, yeah. And they pointed towards some of that stuff much earlier. Things like Valium 10 felt really relevant. But yeah, I had that sort of wilderness years as well with Hawkwind. I bought the music and I played it and I loved it. But I saw them at Troy City Hall in 93. They played there again in 94 and I didn't see them. I know I didn't go to that one. And I didn't see them again until 1999. That was a funny moment. So Nick was there and Harvey Bainbridge was there. But not having seen how they developed post Alan Davey, to see Jerry and particularly Ron march on the stage and really own the band. And it was the first time that I looked at it and thought, this don't feel like Dave's band anymore. This isn't what I understand by Hawkwind. And I don't want to be, not my Prime Minister, not my President, not my Doctor Who, all these sort of hashtags. I don't mean it like that. And this isn't the Hawkwind that I know. And I didn't know if I liked it or not. In hindsight, I think I quite enjoyed it, but it wasn't my cup of tea. Ron was very much at the front. He had lots to say. Lots of it was an F word or a C word, which you never heard at Hawkwind gigs. That was a rarity. And it just felt like Dave might be detached from it a bit at that point. And that's not fair because Dave was on Hawkwind duty every week. I queried him about this the next year on a questionnaire thing they did on their Mission Control website at the time. And it was very much, we are not dead, only sleeping or something like that. He was really trying to keep everything together and it was his band and he was working on it every week. But there was just a moment where it didn't feel quite right. But I had this quote from Jerry that I used in a record collector feature about the live 1997 CD that was the Passport Holders CD. And Jerry had made sure that every gig on that 97 tour was soundboard recorded and spent hours and hours and hours working through the tapes, compiling that Passport Holders CD. But he said, we did this thing. We never played Fetterman Street, but we did it once. We didn't tell Dave we were going to do it. And we decided that we'd go into it and let him catch up sort of thing. 1, 2, 3, 4, and off they went into it. And you could see Dave was shocked, but coped with it. And, he likes that sort of thing. And I read that again today and I thought, I bet he didn't like that sort of thing because Dave is professional and methodical and wants everything to be right. That's why the gigs are so great. And what I noticed recently is how much Dave actually conducts the band and how much he's pointing to Richard to do this or indicating to Doug or Tim, this is where we break down this bit or this is where this bit starts, and really is the musical arranger on stage of the band. I've never really asked him about it, but I just wonder whether that was a moment where it sort of started to go edging in a direction that he didn't want to go in. And I think that's why you see a sort of reconfigured band in 2000 down in Australia. And then once they've got the orchestra thing out the way and Alan comes back and it becomes much more the sort of Hawkwind you've always been to see,
Dave, obviously, he's the captain. He steers the ship, doesn't he? But there are occasional moments in Hawkwind history. Astounding Sounds leaps out as one where they go in a different direction and Dave kind of wrestles it back. If I'd thought maybe this was what was going to keep happening, I might think differently. But when I look back through the catalogue, I love the fact that they're there. Matt, you've said this once or twice with Hawkwind albums. Levitation was one where you're not sure you want the band to be this, but you love the fact that this album existed or this version of the band existed.
Yeah, I think it's weird in a way. I try to listen without having too much of an opinion on the band to try and colour my feelings of it, if you see what I mean. Like, I wouldn't be able to do a podcast on Gorillaz, for example, because, I'm too big a fan of it. And if suddenly they did a whole album with William Shatner or something, I would probably have things to say before I'd even heard it.
I would love that.
Yeah. I guess a lot of it as well is that I don't know most of it until you tell me, literally, when we're doing the podcast. So it is new news. But even when you're listening to it, you can hear things are different. Like Levitation, you can really hear that something new is happening. And definitely within your area, with Captain Riz all over it, again, you feel like it has a different ring to it. And I think that even though we talked about the fact that Dave is happy to bring people into the band to see what's going on, when you replace a vocalist, it does change things. There's just no way around it. Like you can bring in harder drummers, you can bring in groovier bassists, but as soon as you bring in a different vocal and a different tone, it does change things. We've talked about Hawkwind in the 70s where we had Lemmy singing for a while and we had like Calvert and that kind of thing. And that was a bit more loosey, a bit more artistic, thought experiments and stuff. I feel like you can really feel when we get Ron Tree that there is that feeling that it wants to be a little bit more thrashy, a little bit more rocky again. And I'm kind of glad that they did still have the synth chops to back up their sound through it and save it. Because I think if you didn't have that and it just spiraled off into a whole album of Amphetamine Streets, that wouldn't have felt as Hawkwind. I know sometimes it's a bit controversial, but Sputnik Stan for me was a great example when actually everything comes together. They have that gorgeous synth breakdown in it. However, it still has some power to it, but it's got a space story. And again, it's like, oh, cool, the pieces are still here. Distant Horizons was a really interesting one because I think actually that one, some of the synth stuff really won out, and it had been fighting a bit of a losing battle throughout a lot of the early 90s. But things like Waimea Canyon Drive and Population Overload, it sounded like a nail spar in the distant solar system. The synths weren't just sweeping up what all the rocket stuff had broken. It actually felt like it was all coming together in interesting ways. And I think that is something about the 90s in general. When I'm thinking about the kind of music that I started listening to, that electronic music was very experimental then. Like samplers were coming into their own. We actually had wavetable synths that were worth a damn. We had analog synths that still had that power. And I felt like Hawkwind had a lot of these in their toolbox. And I felt that they never stopped experimenting in that side as well. And I think it was that push with the other people coming in that actually gave us some of the most interesting tracks that we had. So I'm very glad that they never gave up, because I think if they did, it would have been even harder to review. I think it would have taken 3 years instead of 2.
And this clash of things, Ian, with the new experimentation with these massive synths, but still there being people in the band wanting to do space rock in its more 70s essence, does end up producing 2 pretty heavyweight albums in Alien 4 and Electric Teepee.
I'm always amazed that Alien 4 is a little bit less talked about because, again, Alien 4, 1995, Chronicles of the Black Sword, 1985, War on the Edge of Time, 1975. These are the 10-year albums sort of thing, And now Alien 4 seems to have been a bit forgotten. And that surprises me a bit. I think there's an interesting creative tension going on through the band right through the 90s. You've got Bridget coming in and doing a really sterling job on visuals and picking up some vocals. I think she could have done more vocals, to be honest with you. I was always disappointed she got dropped off the vocals of Golden Void because she does it so well in the Bedrock gig. And I felt she could have done more vocals, but they really lent towards her abilities as a performance artist as well, which on the Space Bandits tour was very evident. So you had that, and then you had Richard getting really interested in dance music and moving away from the rockier stuff. I said to him, it is the business of the future, a Richard Chadwick solo album. And he said, that's crazy. Everybody else is on it. Why would you say that? And it's just a bit like, is Church of Hawkwind a Dave Brock solo album? Captain Lockheed is almost all Hawkwind, isn't it? You can almost slot it into the Hawkwind canon, but it'd still be a Bob Calvert solo album. And I meant it in that sense, you can see different pieces where a prevailing view or a new enthusiasm driven by one particular member makes a particular album more skewed towards the sort of things that they've got interested in. So I meant it in that sense. And I talked to Richard about that and he couldn't quite see what I was getting at. And Richard is really eclectic about the music he loves. And I think some of the stuff in the mid bit of the 90s is very driven by stuff that he was getting excited about. And then, you do have that contrasting thing with Jerry and Ron where they are going off in that different direction, which Jerry said, oh, Richard was sort of into that as well. And I can get that from Richard's punk and squat bands type thing. I can imagine why he would be, but it was very much Jerry and Ron. And I suspect it might not have fitted with what Dave really wanted to do, which is why there was that gradual switch over to a more traditional Hawkwind lineup with Simon House and Hugh to come in the next decade.
It's interesting with Richard because as we read in a couple of books and we documented in the early 90s records that when he joined Hawkwind, Richard hadn't done an awful lot of studio drumming and initially found it a challenge and overcame that challenge by using a lot of electronics, which is naturally going to take you into those kind of trance techno sounds, I would imagine. And therefore, I can imagine that 2 things happening simultaneously in Dave and Alan starting to get heavily with the synths and Richard doing the electronic drumming. Lots of things lined up to take them in that direction. Matt, the 90s would be quite a big decade of music for you, I would imagine, kind of born in the early 80s. And we've talked in the past about how my background is quite guitar driven and your background is quite keyboard driven. And the things that I was getting into that took me away from Hawkwind in the 90s was Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, the heavier side of grunge. But keyboards and synth sounds and that kind of producer ethic, it's kind of in your DNA, isn't it? In many ways, to me, it felt like Hawkwind moving slightly away from me and towards you. How much did you pick up on Hawkwind's use of synthesizers?
A lot, I think. I don't know why, but when I first started to hear dance music at a younger age, it always intrigued me. even the fact that people would make DJ sets out of this music, that was very appealing for me. I used to go to Oxford and buy tape packs of recorded raves, that I was too young to go to, but that kind of music was always very interesting to me, and I would listen to it on a Walkman and try and identify when tracks changed. And there's some of that in Hawkwind, especially when they do their live stuff where they drop into another track and then come back out of it again. I always find that very pleasing, because that for me is very much in the way I experience music. When Hawkwind try and do electronic music in the style of what was popular then, I never think they do it very well. But when they take bits of electronic music and do it in their style, I think it's brilliant, if that makes sense. There's a track on one of the live albums that I'm sure we'll get to called like The Acid Test. And it's a very good acid line in terms of they're really using a Roland 303 to get that feeling, and they're calling it acid and it's making acid. So they obviously know what that is. I think that track is boring as hell, but they used an acid line over Love in Space, and that was just the pepper on top of that track to make it absolutely amazing. So I feel like when they take stuff and bring it into what they're doing, that's the most exciting. As we said, with things like Sputnik Stan, with that crazy breakdown that I wasn't seeing coming, Wave Upon Wave, where they were using this bit crush filtering to make it sound like we were underwater. And those are all the bits where you suddenly feel like there's some real experimentation and imagination going through. What I also appreciate is the fact that they went as far as they did and stopped, because with some of the new people in the band maybe pushing it too rocky, if they'd have pushed the other direction and tried to be the new Chemical Brothers, I don't think that would have worked either. But it's finding these little bits where they're like, this works with what we want to do. But I think a lot of the stuff that they use for all their pads and modulation as well, and never letting things feel flat. Things are always moving around. They're being affected. They're being played with. So yeah, I think this was a decade that I was really able to get into and find references from. I've been able to quote Chemical Brothers. I've been able to quote Left Field. I think we quoted 808 State at some point. So definitely they're running in those circles without sounding like they're trying to be them. It's sounding like they're hearing what's going on and they're bringing that stuff in.
Well, of course, and also, Matt, on the extended versions of the albums that we get now, in particular Business of the Future, there are trance remixes, techno remixes of Hawkwind tracks by people who I assume must be well known in their scene. There was the Cybertrance remix was the one I was particularly thinking of, which was one that you didn't pick in the end, but which was in your head. There's kind of things like that floating around. Ian, Matt mentioned the live albums there, and I want to come to those with you in a minute because there's really interesting things there. But quickly, I wanted to get your take on White Zone, because one interesting thing that feels to me with Hawkwind, particularly in this period, is that rather than being a band who work behind the scenes a lot and then release an album every 5 years, and that is a snapshot of where they're at, and then they go behind the scenes again, Hawkwind seem to do their working out in public. And White Zone is interesting in that kind of context.
When you look at what came out on Electric Teepee, Richard said, we wanted it to be a positive outpouring. And because there was only 3 of them, so it's a manageable, small, compact lineup, so you can work a lot, either on the road or in the studio. So you can see why that 3-piece lineup were able to bring out that outpouring and, as you say, work out their doodlings in public. And I don't mean the music was doodlings in that sense, but White Zone, I bought it, I played it a few times. It didn't quite resonate with me, but you can see that they are working on different ideas and they want to be something a little bit different, and they take the brave thing and putting it out under a different name, but everybody knows who it is, so, it's still going to sell. But one thing I was thinking as Matt was talking there, if you were a musician of note, it was okay to say that Hawkwind was a big influence. We often talk about Hawkwind being an influence on punk rock and John Lydon and Joe Strummer and Pete Shelley and Pauline Murray. These people weren't saying it in 1977. It took something like John Savage's England's Dreaming book to really get into the roots of interviewing all these people in punk who then came along and said, oh, yeah, no, I was listening to Hawkwind and stuff. Budgie, the Banshees drummer, talks a bit about Hawkwind in his Misery Fest memoir I read over Christmas. But he talks about, his earliest bands were Hawkwind influenced and stuff, but nobody was saying that back in 77, 78. Whereas the people who were making electronic music and dance music and the rave scene, they were in the 90s contemporarily saying, hey, Hawkwind, that was an influence on us. So I think the 90s became the moment when If you were a known musician, if you were a professional musician, if you were producing work that was being recognised, you could say, and by the way, Hawkwind got me to some of this stuff. So that was a sea change.
It's a pretty amazing thing, isn't it, for any artist or band to be cited as an influence on such a diverse range of musical genres.
Yeah.
It really speaks to how they move around and shift and have the foundations of so many things. So the live albums kind of came to me quite late. Matt and I, neither of us are particularly live album people. There are particular live albums which stand out. Space Ritual is obviously one. Live Chronicles, which we obviously chatted about with yourself a couple of years back, is another. But as a general rule, both Matt and I tend to be studio album people. And obviously for the benefits of the Hawkbinge podcast, if we did all of the live albums, we would be constantly talking about tracks that we've already talked about. So we tend to stick to the studio albums. But the three big live albums of the 90s, Palace Springs, The Business Trip, and Love in Space, they're pretty meaty albums, aren't they?
They really are. I was thinking, as we were talking about how they experimented, people again look back on the work they've done differently, don't they? So I remember on Facebook several years ago, somebody was ribbing about Hawkwind being a prog rock band. And I posted that very abbreviated, rapid, aggressive version of You Shouldn't Do That on The Business Trip. It's the track that I would play if somebody said to me, Hawkwind is just another prog rock band. And I posted it on Facebook, and Alan Davey came on the thread and said, yeah, but we weren't able to jam and it was all sequenced. And I think that's in hindsight, because I think at the time they were all getting really excited about what they were doing. So that sequencing thing from the 90s, I think, somebody like Alan would look back on it and go, yeah, but actually it wasn't what Hawkwind was all about. But then there's this urban myth about this totally improvisational band that the releases we're getting now sort of puncture the myth a little bit.
Even if you've left yourself space to improvise, by the fifth gig on the tour, you're probably improvising, quote unquote, the same thing you improvised the day before. And, 100 gigs in, I can imagine it being a pattern. And as you say, they're very, very good at what they do. I'm going to segue this to our selections of non-studio album tracks. I'm doing that using the live albums because, it's our show, so we make the rules and we're pretty lenient with what the rules are when we're predicting non-studio album tracks. In the most part, we're kind of looking for B-sides of singles or studio releases that weren't released on albums, that kind of thing. But the interesting thing with Hawkwind Live is that because they'll do these lineup changes and these massive stylistic changes, when they do bring in a new singer, the new singer isn't tasked with singing the way the old singer did. When you bring in a new instrumentalist, they're not tasked with playing the same part on the same instrument that the last person did. And therefore, live album versions of tracks can be radically different, like almost entirely new tracks. And when you get to people like Bridget coming in and singing Golden Void, you don't think of these things as being lesser because it's not the original band doing it in the way that you might with other bands who've been going for donkey's years, but there's only one original person left and it feels like they're a cover band of themselves. Hawkwind never cover themselves, do they? It's always something completely regenerated and new.
That's what we love about them, isn't it?
Exactly that. So we have each, in the tradition of our wrap-up decade shows, we have each of us picked 3 tracks which do not appear on the Canon Studio albums that we've covered during the run. We will put these out on a Spotify playlist, which means that our selections have to be on Spotify. But actually, Hawkwind being Hawkwind, there are some deep cuts that are out there, Ian, that you flagged up and are really interesting that haven't made it onto Spotify. But we didn't just want to let them go. We wanted to chat about these a bit because they're really interesting, and we'll post links to these on the socials following the show. There's some interesting ones out there, and you introduced me to a couple of them that I'd never heard of. I Am the Eye is one of them.
This was me being too clever by half and not checking Spotify. So there's this really interesting one. One of the ones I did pick because you could have it on Spotify, and I think it's a soulmate of it, was Black Sun, which was on the Quark EP. And it's just a lot of improvisation in the studio around a common theme, almost like a great rock band would do. I think it's turned up once on CD. I think it was on an American compilation. It never got onto the Cherry Red reissues. I did ask them why, and I never found out why that one had been missed. And I'm really sad it had been. Matt will hate it because it morphed into Blueskin. But it started out as this really long improvisation track that builds and builds and then gets into that familiar thing that we know from Blueskin. And then the first time it turns up is on the winter tour of 94. So there's a gig in Cologne where it's the opening number. But it's got some weird lyrics about being the end of city culture. And it starts there. And then suddenly, by the time of Alien 4 and the Love in Space tour, it's turned into Blueskin. So they were really busy. They were really working in lots of different things. But when they had something they thought, this is quite good, then they'd use it 2 or 3 times. You know, if it's good, get the best out of it. And I really love that it's got a very krautrock, hypnotic. It's not motoric in that sense, but it's got that continuous addictive rhythm to it that Black Sun also has. So they're sort of soulmates. I think they're soulmates with things like You Shouldn't Do That, particularly the live version of You Shouldn't Do That we hear on the Space Ritual box sets, and Valium 10 as well. I think they're in that menagerie of Hawkwind tracks, as it were, and I really love it. And it just, just the way it populates through from being this unknown opening track on some European dates through to being Blueskin in the Alien 4 era. I think it's just really quite fascinating.
And there's another one that you brought up, which is actually very much a Bridget track, which is Seventh Star.
Seventh Star is a sort of coda to Night of the Hawks. So if you remember Night of the Hawks on the Bedrock gig, it breaks out of Night of the Hawks and goes on with some more instrumental stuff. And then Bridget comes on with some lyrics. As I recall, those aren't the Seventh Star lyrics, but when they were touring there afterwards, the Seventh Star lyrics, which are just the description of the night sky and the different stars appearing, is just a really beautiful coda to Night of the Hawks. It takes it off somewhere different. It never appears separate from Night of the Hawks, so it's always that end coda piece that we first hear, as I recall, we first hear at Lenton Lane for the Bedrock gig. It does turn up on the Live in Nottingham and somewhere. There's a double CD that Gonzo or Voiceprint put out that has Lenton Lane and another gig from around that era, and Seventh Star with its own lyrics is on that. There's lots of interesting things that are lost to odd bootlegs. The last few gigs she did with them, there's a tape at Mildenhall, a very truncated gig because the festival ran late and they could only play like 50 minutes or something. And there's a poem she does that leads into Out of the Shadows that I don't think I've heard anywhere else and isn't on any official ones. And so there's lots of little obscuros like that. And we remember from the Lenton Lane gig, when she comes in during Ejection and during Damnation Alley as well. But yeah, Seventh Star, find it on YouTube. It's really lovely and highly recommend it.
And you mentioned one other, which is so obscure that not only had I not heard of it, I couldn't find it after you told me about it, which is Anna Seed.
I think there is a YouTube version of it somewhere. So the first time we know them playing it's 1998 at Carleen near Helston in Cornwall. The only rock gig they play that year. And Ron Tree actually does that wage war thing that Bob Calvert had recited. It's not a Bob piece, but Bob had recited back on the Empire Pool gig in 73. Does that. And this thing called Anna Seed. Anna is as in the name and seed as in a seed. Or some people think it might be called aniseed. So nobody really knows. I think it's a stable mate with Hippie and some of those type things that Jerry and Ron were playing around with, that crawling acid rock music that they were trying to steer the band in the direction of. So I've never heard a really good version of it in terms of sound quality. It's a curio, it's one of those things. I think there's one the following year called Money Tree as well. It's never appeared anywhere, but it's one of those little curios. If you listen to a few live tapes, you hear.
For those of you who want to hear those, we will find those on YouTube and we'll drop some links into socials so you can dig those out. The next 9 tracks you will not have to dig out because they will go onto a Hawkbinge playlist. 3 of us have picked 3 tracks each. Ian, as honoured guest, had first pick, and really there could only be one first pick. I think it was going to be first pick for all 3 of us. Probably the big orphan track of the 90s, Ian, is Treadmill, is it not?
Treadmill, I think it's fascinating. I put that as a stable mate with Damage of Life. I think I might even say this in Sonic Assassins, that the two feel complementary, sort of world-weary, and Dave doesn't write about his own life and he doesn't write about what he's thinking, in terms of personal stuff. He's not that sort of lyricist. And that's why Treadmill and Damaged Life are quite striking, because it seems to be songs where he's having a look at his own state of the nation and, that I've tried so many different ways. I've watched each one of them decay. But that's what's made Hawkwind so brilliant.
Matt, this is a strong track, right? This was on your shortlist as well.
Yeah, I think it's one of those ones which feels timeless. Like we run the treadmill every day. That doesn't feel like it's something that's ever changing. I think given the last couple of years and, people worried about jobs and economies and that kind of thing, just listening to this felt a little like, yeah, this is still as timely as ever. It actually took me a while to really listen to it without feeling a bit like sick. But that's good in a way, when you think about it. Sometimes I do ding Hawkwind on trying to put too many words into a sentence, but this one was really nicely done. It has this really nice cadence throughout the whole thing. There's actually in the second verse, they use a word with two syllables where it's calling for one, but the way that they enunciate it, the two works really well. And I remember listening to that being like, oh, nice one, Hawkwind, you nailed that. The topic was timely, and also the attention to detail in the words and the way it was all put together was really nicely done.
Yeah, and there's some real bite, I think, in the lyrics, even like when you end up with the office block from which we march, the mirrored shades of the patriarch, things like this. It's a slightly angry track as well as a slightly weary one.
And the violin is lovely on it.
Yes, isn't it?
It's just pitch perfect. It's just brilliant.
I mean, surely this track is too strong to be almost a bonus track on a live album. My first thought is, what is it doing here? Why is it not on a studio album or its own like EP release or something? Because wherever you put Treadmill, it would be one of the strong points.
No, I agree. I think it was played at the Lenton Lane gig, but didn't make the final broadcast, if I remember right. But somebody will correct me on that if I'm wrong, I'm sure.
Such a strong start and a good one to lead off the playlist. My first one will probably slightly annoy Matt because we talked about this on the Distant Horizons podcast, because the three bonus tracks are on the vinyl reissue, the double vinyl. They make up side 4. So we kind of covered them and I really like it. My memory is that, Matt, you weren't so keen, but I went for Archaic. It's properly heavy metal Hawkwind. And as we talked about, it's one of those things where I like the fact that it exists, but I'm glad it wasn't what they became. I'm not sure that it is Jerry Richards. I don't think he's listed, but it feels Richardsy. Very heavy, very metallic, got some bite to it. It's a kick-ass track. I really like that on Distant Horizons, Ian.
I think it's a Jerry track, from what I understand. Jerry told me that one, and the other one that's on the bonus tracks on Distant Horizons, I can't remember what the other one's called, but Jerry told me they were his, or his and Ron's, so I assume that's the case. It certainly sounded like, again, what was happening on Distant Horizons, they're Ron and Jerry driven type tracks.
It reminded me, when I re-listened to it, of how fresh and surprising Distant Horizons felt to me when I played it, although it may have been that we'd spent 8 months on a couple of albums that were a little bit more difficult. Matt, your first pick fulfills a promise you made 2 years ago.
Yeah, some of these picks for me are more my redemption arc. I do this, I think, on a few of the 70s and 80s ones as well, finding a couple of tracks which never made it to the actual playlists, but at least I can put it on this to kind of chronicle it somehow from the podcast point of view. And it's Out of the Shadows, the live studio version, which is on the extras of the extended version of Space Bandits. I said in our podcast of Space Bandits that I would try and give Out of the Shadows the respect it deserves somehow, and here it is. The live studio version is a whole 3 minutes longer as well. And I remember, Andy, you said you wished it was longer, and now it is.
Yay.
The original started off with this kind of sound of motocross bikes, and it also has that strange sort of flanging or echo on the drums that always gave me that DJ anxiety, because it always sounded like it's what happens when you play two tracks and they're not quite going together. So I always hated that whilst liking the track. And in this version, you start off with a more interesting synthy intro and you don't have that treatment on the drums. So for me, it's actually a better version anyway. So I feel like that's a good happy accident to get it onto this playlist. I also feel like the lyrics are a bit more present in this version. There's a clarity to them, which I feel like the original doesn't have so much. So I do feel from an audio point of view, despite this being live, because it's live studio, I guess it still sounds really nice. So I like that a lot. Other than those parts, it's still really the same driving rocker that we liked from the album. I think the extra 3 minutes are dedicated more to instrumental freakouts instead of more out-ofs and into pieces. But that works for me. I think you get the idea of the amount of out-ofs and intos we have. I think that's fine. The halftime breakdown is still there with that cool bassline switch up. It makes the 8 minutes of this track not feel so long. It's a shame in this version we lose that weird part where we got that bomb, 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 bomb vocal treatment and that sudden feeling that we're at the Oscars or something with that theatre audience applause. But, it's not a deal breaker for this. So I'm glad we're able to chronicle it here after it missed out on the playlist picks on the podcast.
I've got to go and look for that because I have to say I haven't heard that version of it. But I like the version on Space Bandits. I much more love the version on the Bedrock gig, even though it misses a set of lyrics. And when you get to 91 and they were playing it as a three-piece, as just a guitar, bass and drum thing, I think it's fantastic. But you've got to go digging around the bootlegs for that.
It's become one of the big staples, isn't it, Out of the Shadows from that album?
Oh, very much so, yes. Real statement of intent. What did Richard call it? An anarchist manifesto? I don't quite understand how he gets to that, but I've always loved it. I think it's really ballsy and dynamic. And as I say, in its different incarnations through the years. Sometimes I love the Bedrock version the best. Sometimes I love the 91 trio version. It's just great. It's just great.
And I'm very happy to see it on the playlist because I was slightly gutted when it missed out from Matt's picks first time round. And so, Ian, your second, you alluded to it a little bit earlier, is from the Quark EP. It's Black Sun.
Yeah, I think that's another Richard-driven track, isn't it? Again, a little bit leaning towards 70s German bands, perhaps. Very elongated, very repetitive. It's not a motoric track by that definition, but I just love that addictive repetitiveness, and that's what Black Sun has. I just like that repetitive urgency. Great stuff.
I bought the CD with its two versions of Uncle Sam on Mars, its version of Quark, and Black Sun. And I bought it because of Black Sun, because it was a track that wasn't on one of the previous records. Definitely was on my shortlist and probably the one that I listened to most from the EP because it wasn't a version of a previous track, and definitely feels like it's in that TP Business of the Future kind of area. For my picks, a bit like you, Matt, I looked at the live albums and looked for tracks which I didn't recognize from studio tracks. And I came across a track called Elfin, or Elfin Safety, as I started to think of it. And Elfin is basically a 2-minute synthesizer bridge between two other tracks, but it's long enough to be given its own title and its own space. And I just played it over and over and over. It's only just over 2 minutes, so I'd loop it a few times. And the interesting thing is, in season 1 of Hawkbinge, I think it's probably in our first session playlist, I picked Equinox by Jean-Michel Jarre, which is a massive favourite of mine. It's from like 1975 or something. Very, very, very big keyboard sound, big analog synthesizer basses. And Elfin sounds like an outtake from Equinox to me, which is a very, very good thing to be. And I fall into it. I'd love it if they'd have worked this into like a 4, 5, 6 minute track. But for what it is, it doesn't last too long. But I think it's a beautiful bit of mood. I really like how it does glue two different tracks together.
It's a great bridge, very shimmery and icy and atmospheric. I think it's great, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it shows the variety again of what they're achieving in their synth voices as well. The fact that they can go classic, quote unquote, at the same time they can go more sort of modern and contemporary and messed up and distorted and shiny and everything. It's really nice that they never lose that in their repertoire ever. No matter who they bring in, no matter what they do, they've always got these things which come in to give you that little lovely palate cleanser. And as we've seen live, even like at the Royal Albert Hall, they still do that now. So it's so ingrained in their DNA and it's great for that.
Have you seen Alfin with the visuals as well, Andy, on the video?
I haven't, no. I will look that up.
It's really great. I think it must be Chris and somebody else who's one of the dancers. They're holding up these really big gossamer alien type characters. You see it with that as well. The whole thing comes together and just brilliant stuff on a budget, which is what Alien 4 Tour was. But what they do with the budget is so great. Yeah, if you love the track, you can watch it with the visuals as well.
Absolutely, I will, because I do love that track. So I will definitely check that out. And Matt, talking about palette cleansers and different synth voices, you have Photo Encounter.
Yeah, from Love in Space. It's like yours, I guess. It's another ambient piece from Hawkwind. The whole thing is set around a slightly scorched orchestral sample, which gives this very dramatic, imposing mood. I can't tell if we've heard these strings before in a Hawkwind track. They feel familiar somehow, but I can't put my mental finger on where they're from. But they're very evocative anyway. And there's some snatched dialogue about two people trying to get a photo of something, possibly a UFO. And then there's a sound like a police radio chatter as well to add some texture in it. And we've got these ethereal synths that drift in and out of the top end, so they fill the whole audio spectrum, which again they're very good at this point. And it's sandwiched between on the album live versions of Are You Losing Your Mind and Blue Skin, and you hear crowd sounds before and after the track. So I think this might have been recorded live. It doesn't specify, at least on the version I was listening to, but if so, it would have been great to have heard them play it. I can imagine some theatrical lighting and the band all backlit or something happening on screen or something. I think it could have been quite something to behold. And again, it's a great way of just for a second just changing your mental perception before they go into something bigger.
I'd like to say that whole live album, the Love in Space live album, is the space ritual of the 1990s, but Oz Hardwick would slap my wrists next time he sees me. Sorry, Oz.
And actually, staying with Love in Space, because Ian, that is your third pick.
Guys, you've talked about this track so often and never talked about the lush, orchestrated, brilliant version that is the centrepiece of the Alien 4 tour and the Love in Space album. It's the centrepiece of the record. It's gorgeous.
Matt, the album version was actually one of your picks for the master playlist. So this version must have been one that appealed to you.
Love in Space, the studio version, was the playlist pick. And also the White Zone version of it was the other playlist.
So it's all over the playlist. Very good.
This has become almost my Sonic Attack in terms of lots and lots of versions of it. But yeah, there's something about this particular track that whenever they do something to it, it works. It seems to be a uniting piece that everyone in the band seems to get behind. In the White Zone version, it was gloopy and strange and weird, and I had this feeling of a big gelatinous monster creeping inevitability to it while still being quite groovy. Then the Love in Space studio version completely switched that up. As I said, it had that kind of acid line to it. It had become a very different thing. And then this version of it just felt like the live elements felt more organic. Somehow it felt more performed, over-programmed. So it's another great version of it. I'm collecting these now, and I'm very happy about them.
Definitely. And well done, Ian, for putting us straight regarding having a definitive version of Love in Space now appearing on at least 3 Hawkbinge playlists. My last one is a version of Quark, Strangeness and Charm, and it's from the EP we mentioned earlier. And the interesting thing about this is that I wouldn't have thought it was live.
I don't think it's that live on the business trip, to be honest with you.
Yeah. And the full title of it, when you play it on Spotify, is Quark, Strangeness and Charm, single version with no audience overdub, which suggests that on the live album, there is an audience dubbed over the top of it, rather than it actually being the capture of the crowd. I'm sure that's standard practice for bands doing live albums. You got to mic the crowd so that you can process them properly into the track. But I'd never really picked up the fact that that meant it was on a live album somewhere. It's not like it replaces the original version of the track for me, but it is radically different. And as such, I found it really interesting. I also wanted to bring it up because it means that we can get some more emails from Matt about the meaning of Quark, Strangeness and Charm, because we haven't had enough emails about that. But yeah, I really like it. It is such a different take on the track from the original, and one that I sink into quite nicely. Ian, were you a fan of this version of the track?
Yeah, I like it, but I wouldn't in a million years swap it for the original.
No.
I like it. People seem to think it was mainly fed in as a studio track into the live gigs. I don't really know. It doesn't sound live, does it? I think it was very heavily sequenced for the live stuff. I don't know the extent of that, but yeah, it was a nice one to revisit, an unexpected one to revisit.
Exactly. And talking of unexpected, Matt, we come to your final pick, which is possibly going to be a highlight for many people. Bring your redemption arc to a close.
Yeah, it's Lives of Great Men live on Palace Springs. Me and Assault and Battery have had a difficult relationship since it first appeared on Warrior at the Edge of Time. I know I found the original to feel sloppy on timing in the drums, poorly mixed and with a ridiculous chorus. And I know I made a bit of a pariah among some Hawkwind fans by saying that. Probably lost a whole bunch of listeners that gave up on it. But this version on Palace Springs remedies pretty much all of the issues I had with the original, which is great. After a zingy little intro, we get the classic synth keys at half time before the bass which is a great choice. For me, it hits that almost like happy hardcore, early rave kind of vibe. So again, dance music sensibilities coming in again. And I said that Hawkwind have proved that they know a little bit of that language and they bring it into their stuff. So I think it sets the atmosphere really well. Then the bass line comes in, the strings pick up the pace to match it, and it feels like we're picking up speed. Then the drums and the guitar pile in, and we've got ourselves a track. And for me, it's a lot more accomplished in the playing. It doesn't feel like it's going off time. The sound just feels better. The whole thing feels a bit faster, and I don't actually mind that. Maybe because the string's quite blocky, when you're a little bit faster about it, it sounds a bit more animated. I'm not sure, but the delivery of the lyrics also work fine. I was worried that maybe they wouldn't pick up the pace over that, but I think it works. They've even removed that annoying man, which they do at the end of the assault and battery bit, which I really hated, so that improves it a ton. So if ever I need to reach for a version of assault and battery, I now have Lives of Great Men, so hurrah. I'm not sure why they changed the name, but I don't really care. And it even dips really nicely into a version of Golden Void if you let it roll, which I always liked in the other version anyway. So for me, this is a great way to end a 2-decade feud with a track which never really got to grips with, but finally found it. And honestly, after all the Sonic attacks, the Loves and Spaces and everything, I always had faith that one day they would play this in a way which I liked. And I'm glad that I've been able to now find it at the conclusion of the 90s.
That strange noise you can hear is a sacred cow coming back to life. Well done. There are lots of versions of Assault and Battery. Ian, this isn't the worst, is it?
It's pretty good. It has a richness to it that is quite appealing. Going back to that Lenton Lane gig at the very beginning of the 90s, the version on that with Simon House is fabulous. It's not always been great, though, I have to say. I'm with Matt. It's not always been great.
Palace Springs as a whole, it's a solid one. Matt, you messaged me to say that you were pretty into Palace Springs.
Yeah, a lot of people said that they were annoyed that we didn't listen to it. I'm glad that we listen to it now because Palace Springs, Business Trip, and Love in Space, but especially Palace Springs, they are very different to what we call canon, or as far as Wikipedia called canon. It makes me annoyed that we spent so much time listening to In Your Area, to be honest, with the live bit. And I suppose it's interesting how different something like Palace Springs is compared to In Your Area. And it shows again how over the course of the 90s, the band's sound really did change. The live bits of Palace Springs is nice. We didn't talk about Back in the Box, but we were able to get a bit of Bridget in there from that. So it's nice to get her back for a second to help out with Back in the Box. For me, Back in the Box falls down a bit in the middle. You know, it does one of those Hawkwind breakdowns, which is just a bit too broken for it to get the energy up again for me. But it's got a great version of Assault and Battery. It's got a great version of Heads. It's got a pretty good version of Damnation Alley. The new tracks are a mixed bag, but they've got some really great ones. And as we said, Tremble is a great one. Acid Test is a real pace killer for me, which is a shame because it sounds like it should sound good, but for me, it never really gets to where I want it to go to be satisfying. But I listened to it a lot more than I needed to talk about it on the podcast. So I would consider that an endorsement.
Absolutely. So for all of you fans of Palace Springs, of which there are many, because I kept having to explain that it wasn't listed as canon, we weren't going to do it, but now we have, and we agree it's really, really good.
I must say that when it goes Palace Springs, Business Trip, and Love in Space, the artwork for the albums gets better and the output in the albums gets worse. Palace Springs sounds the best, looks the worst, and I think that Love in Space sounds the worst but looks the best. I really wish that Palace Springs didn't look like how it does because it's a big smeary mess and it's really disappointing. Because if it had a Love in Space style cover, it would be the all-round package. But considering that it's what you listen to rather than what you look at, it's fine.
There you go. We can't let it go. We've got to end the 90s with something getting a bit of a kicking, which does round out the 1990s. I hope everyone has enjoyed our coverage of the 1990s. We are now speeding right back up to date with Ian. Ian, we know and love you as the writer of Sonic Assassins, the Hawkwind book that we've read from on every episode all the way through so far. I follow it chapter for chapter. So every time we are ramping up for a new episode, I read that chapter of the book and pick out the pieces that we're going to do. It's a brilliant book. I know so many people out there have it. If you haven't, it will go into so many facets of Hawkwind history that we don't cover. We're not a Hawkwind history podcast. It's really about the music, but the history of the band is beautifully told in that book. But recently, Ian, you have returned to Hawkwind literature. And we're going to talk about two things. Firstly, is a particularly stellar edition of Record Collector presents Hawkwind Masters of the Universe, which I have here. I'm holding up to the screen for people listening to not see. There is a full page dedicated to every album, and you've contributed to quite a lot of the later albums, which must have been interesting for you to come to, Ian.
Yeah, fantastic publication. Joe Kendall, who edited it, did such a good job. I came to it quite late in its process and was asked, would I do the albums that you guys are going to grapple with as well, or have grappled with and will grapple with. So that's In Your Area and Space Rock. But also the Hawkwind Light Orchestra albums, which I do really like. I rate both of those albums.
And they are in the canon list as well.
And they're great. So it was nice to be able to write about those two as well. But challenging to find something to say about In Your Area and Space Rock. No disrespect to those records, they're not the pinnacle of though each of them have their moments for sure. I've never done the follow a tour thing, so I might have seen the band once or twice in a year. But this was 2024, and myself and Neil Bilkey did 4 in a row. So we did Manchester, Newcastle, Edinburgh, and Glasgow. I'm only 60 years old at that point, never been to Scotland before. And we met loads of great characters along the way, made really good friendships. And so Joe said, would I do a tour review? And it was nice to cover that. And, that was the tour that was a little bit difficult because Dave had been very unwell beforehand and just got stronger at every gig. And so it was just great to be able to write that up. But what was brilliant about that for me, and I'm going to embarrass Oz Hardwick again now, because Oz took some photographs at Manchester. Joe selected a photograph there to lead the piece with. So it's words Ian Abraham's, images, photographs, Oz Hardwick. And when I saw it, and Oz has been so kind to me over the years and so generous in stuff that I've written where he's made it so much better with his own photographs. And to have a byline together on a Record Collector Bookazine special was special for me. As I say, I came into it towards the end. So, I was picking up some of the newer albums and stuff, but it was just lovely to be involved. And I hadn't written for Record Collector for 3 or 4 years. And it was just a privilege and a joy to work with Joe, who is such a fantastic editor. So, yes, great stuff.
Fantastic. And I can echo from our side, obviously, we were privileged enough to have Oz doing your job here on our 80s wrap-up show. And what a lovely experience that was. You're talking about Record Collector. Does that put any pressure on you rather than writing as I'm Ian Abrahams and this is my voice? I am writing on behalf of Record Collector.
No, it's just that's what you do as a writer when you're writing for magazines. They have a tone of voice. I used to write quite regularly for Rock and Reel magazine. They have a particular way of writing. So you get into it's a rock and reel review. So I write in this rhythm. It's a Record Collector review. So I write it this way. That's just the tone of voice of any particular magazine that you're writing for has a particular style,
Got it. Well, you've done us a huge favour, and Record Collector have done us a huge favour because, we're several years away from this, given our pace of recording. But I had been looking ahead at certain periods and thinking nothing's written about these albums. And now they are. So you will be quoted for years to come on the Hawkbinge podcast, Ian. A second thing that you've been working on recently, which is a beautiful thing, and we wanted to spend a bit of time on, because I think it's a very meaningful thing, is Marion Lloyd-Langton's book, A Wandering Minstrel, a memoir of Hugh Lloyd-Langton by Marion Lloyd-Langton. It's a wonderful project.
It was a privilege to be involved with it.
How did it come about from your side?
Well, partly because of the bookazine. Back when I wrote the original edition of Sonic Assassins, Marion was very kind. I talked to her on email. She set me up with a phone interview with Hugh, and she gave me an email with some pointers on the tracks that they'd written together, which was great. When Hugh passed away, I wrote his obituary for the Independent newspaper. And although I didn't talk to Marion about it, I did have a very brief correspondence with Kirsty, their daughter. And then Shindig magazine did their own space rock bookazine, and they commissioned me to write a feature on the first Hawkwind album. And I messaged Chris Brock and said, would Dave do an interview? And she said, yes. But what would be really good was if you invited Marion along as well, because Marion remembers all these things as well and will have stories and they'll spark off each other. And so that was the first time I met Marion, at the point at which we sat down around the table, Marion and Dave Brock and myself, and talked about the first Hawkwind album and the characters involved in it, which was really nice. And she's a lovely lady. And then she also wrote for the Record Collector Bookazine, because she wrote a piece on getting Ginger Baker into Hawkwind. And she apparently had said to Joe Kendall that she was thinking about writing The Life of Hugh, or Joe may have said to her, perhaps you should write The Life of Hugh. You've got a natural ability at storytelling. And Joe would have actually been a really great collaborator for her on it, but Joe didn't have the time. And as I understand it, suggested me. And Marion said, oh, yeah, well, I've met Ian before, and dropped me an email and said, can we have a chat? So I rang her up and she said, this is what I'm planning to do, writing A Life of Hugh. And we talked it around, and it couldn't just be The Life of Hugh. It had to be their life together, didn't it? Because Marion is a force of nature and a very clever lady with a great story of her own, a fantastic and interesting career behind her. So it felt like, as we went along, it was their story. So though it's called My Memoir of Hugh Lloyd-Langton as a subtitle, it's their extraordinary life together and the extraordinary lives that they had that led up to that, and the good times and the difficult times.
It's kind of what I was going to say, actually, because it's not a biography of Hugh written by Marion. The whole thing is spoken through Marion's voice and seen through her eyes, which makes it so wildly different from any other music history biography that I've read before. Because, you know, it is very much first person quite a lot of the way through. And as you say, is their story as much as it is his story. And that really comes through.
Marion's a natural storyteller, and so she would get a story down on paper and send it over to me digitally, and I would go through with a writer's eye, just do some tidy ups and stuff. I think it's right to say that it's not a ghostwritten thing. You know, Marion was very hands-on with all the text. I just came along and gave it, an extra polish and just looked after the flow of it and stuff. It is a collaborative piece, but it's very much Marion's book. I hope she wouldn't mind me saying it, but I think it was cathartic. I think there was a cathartic sense of why she wanted to do it. It was hard going, I can't imagine being Marion and getting some of the stuff down on, because Hugh had some difficulties through the 90s. That's sort of resolved, but, he has ill health and that comes to an end. And the pages where she writes about losing him, I had to put them aside for a week because I just didn't know how to edit them or how to polish them or stuff because they were so emotional. And I don't know how she did it because I found it a struggle. I didn't know Hugh. I loved him as a musician, as a creative, as a songwriter, as a fan. How she managed to get down some of the stuff and send across for me to do my bit of assistance with it. I just am in awe of her doing that. And I think it's quite an emotional book. There's some tragedy in it. There's a lot of fun, but there's a lot of tough times in it. And she's been very honest and people love them, don't they? They're cherished and admired amongst Hawkwind fans for the beautiful people they were and the beautiful person Marion is. And it was something I'd never done before. I'd had a go at one. It came to nothing, and I won't say who it was. And I learned from it because I had a load of text and I kept working at it, but I wasn't in dialogue. So I was working in isolation. You can't do these things in isolation. And I thought, well, perhaps that wasn't for me. It wasn't the right thing for me to do. And then when Marion asked me to be involved, it was hard to say no. And I'm so glad I did because it was a different thing. I'd done the biography type things of Hawkwind and the Waterboys. Me and Bridget had done the oral history of the free festivals, which is something different. And then to do this was something different again. Just be the extra voice in somebody's project and trying to help them mould it to the book that they want it to be. I printed out a couple of chapters to give it to my wife to read, and she says, well, this doesn't sound like you. And I said, well, I've got it right then, haven't I?
Exactly what I was going to say. It's why it's such a powerful book, I think, because you read it in the voice of Marion. It's authentic. And that means that those stories of tragedy and those stories of fun and laughter are so much more powerful as a result. And I was actually going to say exactly that. You've done a brilliant job of not injecting your voice on top of Marion's in that sense. I remember seeing her, she was on stage at the last Hawkfest somewhere in Lancashire. So she was obviously still kind of part of the Hawkwind wider family, if you like.
He very much is. Dave and Chris are very fond of her and she's very fond of them and they're very good friends.
And Hugh, of course, there are some great stories. Obviously, the really famous one of Hugh drinking the LSD spiked orange juice when they're playing Isle of Wight and then disappearing for a while to re-emerge somewhat heroically in that 80s Hawkwind, where he is without a doubt one of the standout features of Hawkwind during that time. And Marion bringing Ginger Baker into the band on Levitation, that has a significant impact on that record. There's no doubt. I saw Lloyd-Langton Group in Brighton. I have a couple of Lloyd-Langton albums. Outside the Law, which has 2 Hawkwind tracks on it, which is almost certainly why I bought it. It's got Psychedelic Warlords, where I really liked his version. And the way he plays it ended up being released on the expanded version of Choose Your Mask, Sonic Attack, I can't remember, which is a different way of playing it. And his version of Waiting for Tomorrow is on here.
We should say also that Outside the Law is the only place you can find another great lost Hawkwind track, which is Mark of Cain, which was played in late 84 and a couple of early 85 gigs. It's a terrific number, and it's another of those great lost Hawkwind numbers.
I have a feeling that Outside the Law probably isn't on Spotify, but if it is, then Mark of Cain will shove it on the playlist.
I think they disowned it a little bit because of the sound quality and stuff. It was not Marion and Hughes' favourite release, let's say.
And the other one, Time, Space and LG, I have, which I played earlier today because I remembered I had it and we were going to record today and talk about Hugh. I think that's an early 80s release. It's not one of his later ones. But obviously, as you say, really well loved by Hawkwind fans.
I'm really thankful of the volume of emails and messages that Marion's received off the back of the book. I mean, there's lots of lovely reviews on Amazon. I don't scratch the surface of the people who've written to her and they either wanted to tell a story about Hugh. There's one chap, and I must put it in a blog one day, who wrote and explained how Hugh had caused him to become a musician. And there's so many people they met along the way that they influenced or helped along. All these wonderful stories that haven't come out before that Marion shares in the book. I just think it's a joy.
There are a number of people in the final stage of the book. There are lots of stories told by people coming in with their memories and their stories of Hugh. Did Marion just have those, or were those people that you contacted? How did that come about?
They were all interviews that Marion did contemporary to writing the book. She got out her address book and rang all these people and went to see them, travelled around the country, went to see them to talk about Hugh and, then transcribed them. And again, because people are talking and then you have to tidy it up a little bit and make it flow properly, and avoid all the, what we call the double dips of people saying the same thing and then saying it again. I did no interviews for the book. I would have done if she wanted me to, but it was her book and my job was to help frame it, which is why we also did the self-publishing route with Amazon. And I know people have different views on Amazon, but if you're doing a book and the book is fairly specialist and it's not going to be published by Omnibus or Penguin or somebody, then Amazon is reliable, because as long as you can create a file and do your print on demand, and it was never about the money, don't get me wrong, but the one thing is they're going to pay you every month. So there's a reliability to it that unfortunately you don't get with a lot of small music publishers who are there for the passion but not the business sense. So that's why we put it out ourselves in the end.
I've got the book. I'm holding it in my hands now. Quality of the book is properly mass published book. Good cover, the writing in it, it's all beautifully laid out. The photos are beautiful. There's nothing quote unquote budget about the self-published book on Amazon. You wouldn't know if you weren't told.
In terms of the layout, there's a bit that she'd sent some caricatures that Hugh had drawn and she wanted included in the books. And there's one of a cat looking out of the window. And she also sent a poem that she'd written about Hugh after Hugh died. Something clicked in my brain that these go together. That was the one bit where I thought, oh, Ian, you've done a decent job with that bit. And it just looks beautiful. If you know the picture and the poem, they complement each other so beautifully. And that was the bit that I was really proud of.
It is wonderfully done. It's a beautiful book, a really good tribute to Hugh and to Marion. Brilliant work, Marion, and great work, Ian. Brilliant that you were able to help bring this book about. And it's just a wonderful story, a wonderful read, very authentically written and recommended.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
What is in store for you? We know what's in store for us, which is a new millennium. We are about to hit the year 2000. But 26 years on from that, Ian, what's in store for you?
So I've got 3 or 4 things in mind. One of them that I must do, and I've made some notes on, is a new version of Festivalised, which is the oral history of the 3 festivals. Every time I run into Richard Chadwick, he says, you must get people's memories down while they're still around. And of course, in that book, a lot of people we interviewed, Mick Turner, Mick Farron, lots of people in that book are no longer with us. So it feels like expanding that would be good. And in Hawkwind terms, roll on Bristol Beacon in June. So me and Neil Bilkey are hitting the train tracks and looking forward to being out drunk by the 2 marks in the local Wetherspoons and all the usual shenanigans of following Hawkwind.
That sounds like a date worth waiting for. Ian, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on our end of season wrap up, talking about the various projects and your picks from 90s orphan tracks and your thoughts on Hawkwind as a whole. We definitely hope that we will see you on Hawkbinge again.
Thank you very much, both. It's always a joy to do these things, and Andy, it's a joy to meet up when we do cross paths at different gigs. So look forward to that in the future as well.
Absolutely. There's every chance that Matt will be over.
Maybe one day my plane won't be delayed.
That's why we didn't cross paths at the Albert Hall, I think, wasn't it? Yeah.
It was, unfortunately, despite my best efforts. Next time for sure.
Excellent. I'll look forward to it. Thank you very much both for having me on. It's been great fun as always.
Thanks, Ian. See you soon.
Thanks so much.
Cheers,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Bye.
Technicians of Spaceship Earth, you have been listening to Hawkbinge, the Hawkwind podcast. It was devised and presented by Andy Hood and Matt Longstaff. The soundtrack was produced by Dissonant. To contact the show, drop us a message on Facebook, Instagram, or X, the artist formerly known as Twitter, by searching @Hawkbinge, or send an email to podcast@hawkbinge.space. Hawkbinge is a proud member of the Deep Dive Podcast Network. To find more great band and music-focused podcasts like this one, head to @DeepDivePodNet on Twitter and dive in. Thank you as always for listening. We'll see you next time.